Egyptian kingdoms. So what does the term pharaoh mean anyways? So he's the first pharaoh. The word pharaoh means the great house. They literally saw the king as kind of being the house of the sun god Amun. And he was a living personification. They believed that he was a living god, but that his body housed the god Amun. And just like the god Amun was responsible, since he was a sun god, keeping order in the sky, making sure that the sun set every day and the moon rose every day, just like he was responsible for the stability in the sky, the pharaoh was responsible for the stability on earth and making sure that everything was working according to order. So the pharaoh was seen as a living god, but he was more seen as this embodiment of the most important gods. And that's what gave him the power to rule. So the political organization of Egypt is pretty much exactly like what we talked about with the Akkadian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire. Basically around this time, they're discovering that this centralized bureaucracy is a necessity for ruling a large population and a large territory. So we have the one guy in charge. We have the pharaoh, and he dictates the laws, he oversees the religious ceremonies, he approves all the projects. However, because Egypt is so large and it has such a big population, he has to rely on trusted officials to make sure that all the orders and laws and policies are being followed. Most importantly, that the taxes are being collected in every region from every person, and that general order is maintained throughout the kingdom. And this is what a bureaucracy is, where the government is divided up into different departments, and there's someone in the head of each department who makes sure that policy is being followed. However, it's interesting that this is true also for Mesopotamia. The priest often had more power than the pharaoh. And this is something that we can't say for sure was always the case in Egypt. But depending on the dynasty, meaning depending on the family that ruled or the person who was in charge, often the priest was given more power than the pharaoh. And that's because the priest was able to directly communicate with the gods. And because of that, he was in charge of all the ceremonies, the rituals, all the things that were important for keeping stability based on their religion. You had to do certain rituals to make sure that the wheat grew and was harvested on time. You did certain rituals to make sure that the floods didn't destroy and kill everybody. So he was in charge of all this stuff. And so because of that, oftentimes the people looked to him as opposed to the pharaoh for dictating what to do. And so because of that, the pharaoh had to listen to the priest, because the priest had that direct line to the gods, and this was very much true in Mesopotamia as well. All right, so when we talk about Egypt, we break it up into three main eras, starting with the unification. When Menes unified Upper and Lower Egypt, it established the very first era, which is called the Old Kingdom. This is the era where all the cool stuff was created. So all the stuff that you think about with Egypt, it was made during this time. And that's why we call it the Age of the Pyramids, because this is when all the great pyramids were built. This is when the Sphinx was built. This is when all the stuff that we kind of identify with Egypt was created. So it was during this era, about 2700 to 2200 BCE, that we have all these great building projects being created. So remember, the pyramids were built as burial places for their kings. They're essentially, this kind of sounds funny, but they were essentially seen as almost like spaceships for the king's soul. That actually is pretty accurate. It was a belief that for the world to continue spinning on its axis and not go off into chaos, the soul of the king had to go into the heavens. So the creation of the pyramids was actually dictated. You can see here the points of the pyramids. They were perfectly aligned to certain stars in the sky, and those stars were seen as the gateways to the heavens. And therefore, there were all these chambers in the pyramid leading into the king's tomb, so that once he was buried, the soul would eventually escape into the heavens through the tops of the pyramids. So that's why I call them spaceships to the heavens, because they kind of were. They were these kind of delivery devices of the king's or Pharaoh's soul into the heavens. Why were they created during this time? Because they weren't really created during any of the other times. It was probably because during this earliest period, there was probably a greater focus on the power of the Pharaoh and the divinity of the Pharaoh than in later periods. This is when the first big kingdoms are being established. This is a big deal, the fact that one person can rule over such a huge territory, or a family can conquer such a big territory. And so because of that, people are probably more in awe of the Pharaoh. And therefore, he was seen as probably being more powerful than in later times. And therefore, these pyramids were created to make sure that this God, who is the Pharaoh, got his soul into the heavens when he died. You guys already know, probably from when you were younger, learning about the pyramids. There's all these different chambers. They were buried with all the stuff that they were seen as needing in the afterlife, including their servants. So this would be a crappy time to be a servant, because when your Pharaoh died, you died too. They killed you because they need you to be their servant in the afterlife. Now, can you imagine being that guy who worked really hard up the ranks, and you just became a servant for the Pharaoh, and 2 weeks later he dies? Then you would have to die too. Just kind of crappy timing. So you would be buried in here along with the other servants, and also all the fine luxuries that Pharaoh would need, like the furniture and the jewelry and that sort of thing. Now the question is, were all the pharaohs buried in pyramids? And that's one of the misconceptions about Egypt. And the answer is no! It was actually very few pyramids that were ever created. Instead, most pharaohs, as well as their queens and other nobility, were buried in these kind of, you can call them hills. A lot of times they're just really simple structures that were built into the sides of hills, or they would dig into the hills and create tombs. And many of these places were still very elaborately decorated. They still had their servants. They still had all the luxuries that they need. But they weren't these elaborate structures. And so if you go to Egypt, and no, I haven't been there, but I like to go, there's this area called Valley of the Kings, as well as Valley of the Queens. And that's where they're still excavating many pharaohs, as well as the wives of the pharaohs. So pyramid building was a very short-lived practice in ancient Egypt. Mummification, though, was the long-lived tradition from the archaic period before the first unification all the way through the Roman Empire. It was something that was continuously practiced. And you can see here, by the time that Greece is taking over and Rome is taking over, they still have the mummies, but they've incorporated the Greek and Roman style of artwork. So this is over a 3,000-year-old practice. So mummies are much more Egyptian, long-lasting tradition than the pyramids are. You guys all know about the mummification practices. The purpose of mummification was that they believed, first off, in an afterlife, which is important, but also the belief that a body had to be completely intact in order to make it to the afterlife. So it's interesting in Egypt where they have this abstract idea, the fact that life continues somewhere else. That's a very big development in human history. However, it's not abstract enough that they can have this idea of a soul that escapes the body. They believe the soul is tied to that body, and therefore the body must also make it to the afterlife in order for that person to continue on. So first it was only the pharaoh and the royal family, but eventually it was just whoever could afford it. So many middle-class merchants, scholars, many of them who had enough money could also be mummified. Many of the dead poor people would just kind of scrape together enough money to be buried in an area of the desert that would naturally dry out your body, and you'd have a form of mummification as well. So the rich had the very elaborate